Well, good morning, guys. Welcome to today's video. I'm excited to share some kind of nuggets with you this morning about some things that I've learned this spring and really some things that I've paid attention to more than anything. It's not so much that there's this new thing I really got to share with you, but when you're talking about growing plants in a nursery and turning this into a viable full-time business, your attention to detail has to be greater than it is when you're just hobbying with plants or when you're doing it as a side hustle. And one of those things that you've got to get honed in on is paying attention to the details involving timing. And I mean the timing of everything. So I want to just dive into this with you guys this morning and just share a few things that I've learned about timing everything in your nursery this year. Now, the first thing that I remember that happened this year as far as timing and us missing the timing, me missing the timing on it was that I started my vegetable seeds too early, or at least I started some of them too early. And I've talked about this with you guys a pretty good bit in videos throughout the spring and just kind of keeping you up to speed on how that project went. But if your frost date is around mid-April like ours is, the very end of January, let's just say February the 1st, is too early to be starting your vegetable seeds, and it's going to cause problems for you. I don't want to rehash all of this again, but it's worth mentioning that if you're starting vegetables or perennials or tree seedlings or anything else from seed, you need to have an idea of how long it takes those plants, whatever they are. You need to have an idea of how long it's going to take those to turn into a sale-ready item and kind of what your time frame is going to be. If you're guessing, if you're just saying, well, we'll just figure it out as we go, that works on some things sometimes, but when you're trying to do many hundreds or even thousands of seedlings at once, you need to have a better idea of when they're going to need the next thing that they need and what your weather is likely to be like at that time based on time of year. So timing out those seedling starts is really, really, really important. Another issue related to timing that, it's not really at least the way that my nursery is set up and with what my capabilities are and my equipment that I have or don't have, it's not really a, hey, here's what you need to do, but it's really a, here's just something that you need to be aware of, and that is those late season cold mornings where you have a light frost, when your temperature is 32, 35, 38 degrees and you're kind of flirting with frost or not. Now, there's no predicting the weather ahead of time. You're not going to know a month ahead of time what the very last day that you're going to have frost is. You can't know that. You don't always get a late frost at all. But we brought in annuals the very last week of March, which is a little early, to be honest. It's a little early for us with our frost date being mid-April. But we had a good forecast for 2 weeks, where it was going to be, above freezing for sure. And the day that we got our annuals and we were going to be opening our nursery the next day, our temperature dipped down to about 34 or 35 degrees. We had a light frost, and we just left the annuals out because our forecast temperature that night was about 40, and we wound up losing quite a few of those first annuals we have. It didn't kill them, but it set them back to where they weren't ready to sell, and they just were ugly. And it set them back for, 3 or 4 weeks at least. And some of them did die. And it just made a mess out of what we were trying to do on our very first opening weekend of the year. So something to consider is something like this. If you're buying in annuals to sell, do you have a way to protect them on those nights when it gets down below 40 degrees in the late winter and early days of the spring? That is an issue of timing. It's also just an issue of your nursery setup and your ability to protect those tender plants in those first days of your nursery being open. So we learned a big lesson there and some things that we'll take forward from that. But, that was kind of a big deal to us, and that hurt in early spring. Another issue pertaining to timing, and this is going to be different with every person's location and their situation, but that is the issue of when are you going to open your nursery for the season? No nursery, especially a nursery like those of you who are watching this channel more than likely, open to the public. Retail nurseries are not open generally 12 months out of the year. So when are you going to open in the spring. How are you going to decide what your opening day is going to actually be? It's a really good question to ask, and there's at least a couple of things to think about when you're making the decision on when to open. One thing that you have to consider is just simply the calendar. I already mentioned this, but the frost date, time of year, that kind of thing. When are you going to open? But a second thing that's a little less obvious is you got to have some kind of feel for the spring fever and the spring fervor that comes with people buying plants, because you want to be in on that when it starts. You don't want people to be buying and buying and buying plants for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before you decide that it's time to open your nursery up. You need to go have a look at your box stores. How full are they with plants in there? Are they packed with plants? And if you go in there on a Saturday, are there people everywhere with shopping carts full of plants? Or are they still just starting to put things in their nurseries? You don't want to wait until they're full and they're blowing and going wide open until you get your nursery open. You want to be open before they get busy. And it's not that you're competing with them, but it's that those big box stores that so many people go to, that tells you something about the pulse and the kind of the temperature about the mood of your market and if they're buying plants or not. And when they get ready to start buying plants, you need to have your gate open. You need to have your for sale or your open sign turned around, and you need to be ready to go. So whatever it is that you need to do in the spring to have yourself ready to go, to have your opening day set, you need to have that done by the time people are ready to buy plants. And typically that's going to be 1 or 2, 2.5, 3 weeks before your frost date. But that's going to vary, and only you can decide that for your area. Another thing to think about timing is having your plants in bloom during the actual plant buying season in the spring. Now, this is tricky because everything blooms at different times and different plants bloom for different lengths of time. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I can tell, you can't do this perfectly with every plant. Now, here in front of me are, I think, 4, maybe 5 varieties of agastache or hummingbird mint. And when we first saw this plant this spring, this is a new to us plant this year. I didn't even know what it was. When I first saw this plant this spring, it was around April the 1st, give or take a week, and we had bought some in to quick flip. They were gorgeous. I thought, we've got to get some of those, so we bought in some very small 100 count plugs. Remember, we're talking first, second week of April by this point. And we potted them, and now here we are the second week of June. So let's just say 8 weeks. It's been 8 or 9 weeks. And they've gotten to, this size in that length of time. But we're at the end of our selling season, at least for the spring. So you can see what I'm talking about with trying to time your plants and getting them nice in bloom in the growing season. So, one of the things that you got to try to learn is, if you're doing perennial plugs in the spring to sell in the spring, how many weeks does it take them to get to a nice full size for a trade gallon or for whatever size pot you're trying to sell your plants in? Some of these you can sell in like a 4-inch pot or a quart pot, some of them trade gallons, some of them full gallons. And you need to think about the timing of those things. You're not going to get it perfect, and you don't have to get it perfect. Your signs that you make for your plants, and we've talked a lot about those little signs, and I'll give you an example of those right here. But these signs that you make, that can serve as your plants bloom. If you don't have actual blooms, you can have a nice pretty color picture, and those go a long way in helping sell plants that are not in bloom. But when the plants are in bloom, they sell even better, and I can't stress that enough. It's a learning process. It's a learning process for me. It's an ongoing learning process for me, but it's something to consider. And then the same timing applies to your fall sales. If you're going to sell your plants in August or September or October, whatever your time frame is for fall, when do you need to get plants started in order to have them pretty that time of year? So you need to be thinking about all these issues for getting your timing right on your plants blooming and being as nice as they can be when it's time to sell them. Now, another thing to consider timing wise, and I'm only including this because it does involve timing, although you're basically helpless against doing anything about it. But that is in your advertising before your sales. Let's say that your sale days that you're open on Friday and Saturday. Well, you got to have that ad out to say by Wednesday night, something like that. At least if you're doing Facebook advertising the way that I do it. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a problem with our Facebook advertising. It was a problem internally with Facebook. We didn't have anything to do with it, but we could not get our ad out when we wanted to get it out. They had an issue with their publishing system. I don't know what it was, but it's just something to kind of have in the back of your mind that, you know, sometimes technology is the greatest thing and sometimes it is the worst thing. And when everything works right, it's wonderful. And when it doesn't work right, it's terrible. And you know, when it comes to doing your advertising and having your business out there for people to know about, whether you do it through a website, whether you do it through Facebook advertising, whether you do it through older means such as, you know, newspapers or these neighborhood periodical types of buy and sell little flyer things that go around, whatever you call those, you just need to be aware that sometimes there are things that happen that you cannot control. Let's say you're waiting for a delivery of plants. You want to sell them on your Friday and Saturday sale, and it's late Thursday afternoon, and you don't have them yet, and a delivery is late. There's not really anything that you can do about some of these things, but they are just things that you need to be aware of. You know, have a plan B if it's possible for you to have a plan B. Try not to have too much riding on one Friday sale or on one Saturday sale. Just try to spread yourself out as much as you can when it comes to not having all your eggs in one basket. Again, not so much a timing thing, but one of those things that timing can really hamper and really mess up if you're not just aware that things happen that are completely out of your control. Now, another thing in your nursery where timing is important is doing plant propagation. Now, this is a silver dollar hydrangea. We propagate a ton of these. This is a great selling plant, beautiful plant. And for doing your late spring, summer season propagation, timing on taking these cuttings is really important. Now, I'm not going to take this video time today to do a tutorial and like a how-to on exactly when to take your cuttings. I've done that before, but you need to make sure that when you're doing your propagation, and let's just say for hydrangeas, because I do a ton of these, I know something about these, that you don't start them too early and that you don't wait and start them too late. There's always kind of a sweet spot in there. It doesn't have to be this exact day. It doesn't even have to be on an exact week. But your wood, your stem, this is what I'm calling your wood, is the actual stem. It needs to look a certain way when you take the cutting from it. You don't want it to be this dark woody look, and you don't want it to be that really tender, flimsy stuff out here on the tip that's going to just wilt in a matter of hours after you cut it. You want it to be that in between those stages of growth wood when you take the cuttings. And when you're starting to do your propagation, you know, maybe it's in mid-May, late May, into June, mid-June. You can do them later in the summer than that, just depending on your plants and how you're growing them and different factors. But you need to make sure that whatever you're propagating, whether it's an evergreen, whether it's a perennial, whether it's a hydrangea, any kind of woody shrub, that you're paying attention to your timing. Because if you get the timing right, your success rate on propagation is going to be way, way higher than if you're just guessing and kind of winging it and hoping for the best. Get the timing right. And the last thing that I would mention on timing, at least for the way that I do my nursery, every nursery is going to be different. If you're a much larger nursery, you're going to think about this different than if you're a smaller nursery like mine. But that is simply this: when it comes to kind of what we call around here nursery season, plant season, we're almost always referring to the spring selling season. And the timing issue here is knowing when to quit. So I live in the deep south, in northwest Alabama, and it is, as of the day we're making this video, it is June the 13th. It is a Thursday, and this weekend is going to be our last weekend of the spring. And on Friday and Saturday, it's going to be 95 and 96 degrees each one of those days. How many people do you think are interested in buying and planting plants when it's in the mid-90s? Not very many. Yep, there's always some. But what we have learned and what we think is true for us, at least in our situation, is that it's not worth being open all of June, all July, and all of August to catch just a customer here or there when we know people are just not buying plants. And we need to take that time to be focusing on propagation and growing out our own plants and keeping our own plants alive and working towards getting everything ready for our fall sales that we do in September. So the timing issue is, how long are we going to stay open in the spring? If your nursery is real small, you may only be open for 3 or 4 weekends in April or May or something like that. Well, that's fine. If you're trying to be open productively as long as you can be, like we are, for us, that takes us into the second or so week of June. You know, if your circumstance varies, my circumstances are different than yours, you have to kind of insert the timing that fits into your context. But something to think about, something to consider is, when are we going to shut this thing down? And then, are we going to open back up in the fall? And if so, when? So you got to be thinking about all that stuff and planning ahead. You know, let's say now, we're planning now for what we're going to be doing in the fall. So, you know, there's always a season and a year ahead of time, at least, that you have to be working in your nursery, and hopefully some of these tips on timing help you with that today. Well, it's certainly not everything there is to know about timing, but I'm trying to get you to thinking about kind of the topic of timing in your nursery, and that there's all sorts of things where your timing has to be considered and even prioritized heavily as you're planning and as you're building your business and as you're figuring out how to go forward with all this. Well, guys, thank y'all so much for watching today. I love y'all, and I'll see you on the next one.